have slides. I don't know where they're going to be. Right there. Okay, wonderful. Hi. So my name is Sam Amore. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. And for the next couple of minutes, I'm here to talk to you about how we can create more transgender inclusive spaces in our facets of everyday life. Now, the topic of this presentation is something that's going to challenge your boundaries and going to really bust open the gender binary, and I hope you guys are ready to do that with me. It's actually a really exciting thing to do. I would also encourage you throughout this and afterwards to use the hashtag TransTalk on Twitter, Facebook, wherever you are, so that way we can talk about this and continue this dialogue, because it's definitely an important one to have. So the first thing I want to talk about is microaggressions. What you say versus what we, transgender or non-binary people, hear. So some terminology to get into. Transgender means that you do not identify with the sex you were born as. Transsexual is a word that you should not use, and here's why. It's a very medical term. It's a term that, while it is correct, like there's nothing actually wrong about the definition of transsexual, it does two things wrong. One, it puts a lot of emphasis on sex, as opposed to people's emotional and social well-being, which is something that transgender people are really just starting to bring out into the light and say, hey, hold on, we're real people in addition to our bodies. Genderqueer and gender nonconforming, as well as the word non-binary, are words that are used to mean that somebody does not operate within a binary system. So maybe they don't identify with the sex they were born at birth, but they don't necessarily identify with the opposite sex either. They're kind of in the middle range. Gender comportment is an interesting term. And so what gender comportment means is it's how we demonstrate our preferred gender through everyday little actions, like how we walk or how we speak, things like that. Now, it's a twofold term, and it really encourages some thinking, because the first thing that's interesting about it is it makes you question, you know, what am I doing? Pay attention to your actions for a minute once you leave this auditorium and think, you know, how is it that I'm moving and speaking and things like that? And the second thing you should think about is the whole fact that the binary gendering system is really arbitrary. I mean, who's to say that I am walking like a man? Things like that. I brought up drag queens and kings in this presentation for a reason, just to specify that there is a difference between being transgender and being interested in drag. Now, there's definitely an overlap, and there are certainly plenty of trans people that participate in drag. But drag is predominantly a performance art. It's not necessarily an identity, and that's something to bear in mind. If you're cisgendered, it means that you were born and you're comfortable with the way that you are. You have no desire to change your identity, your body, anything like that. And the last term here is trans with an asterisk. And that was a term that originated in the early 2000s and has kind of fallen out of favor and then come back. And the asterisk is designed as a footnote to say, yes, I'm transgender, but I'm also a bunch of other things. And we're going to get into those other things. So let's talk about pronouns. As I mentioned, I use they, them pronouns, and those are gender neutral. So let's talk about how pronouns work and how we can use them properly to respect everybody's multifaceted identities. This is a graphic made by Chuka Marquez for BuzzFeed. This article actually came out a couple of months ago. And so you have the speech bubble that says, they pronouns are too grammatically weird. And then you have the person thinking, what you're really saying is grammar is more important to me than respecting your identity. And this, what's being said in the speech bubble, is actually a microaggression. And here's why. I understand that it can be very difficult for some people to wrap their head around the concept of pluralizing something that should be singular, right? But the thing is when somebody comes up with their own pronouns and they say, these are the pronouns I want to be addressed by, it's not arbitrary. It's actually very, very important to that person. It's just as important as pronouncing someone's name right or things like that. So if somebody's getting hung up on the grammar of the pronouns versus the usage and why they're being used, it can actually be very disrespectful inadvertently. Now, the person saying that might not actually be transphobic. They might not actually be sitting there saying, I don't care about trans people, I don't want to respect them. They might actually really want to be an ally. But just bear in mind not only how you use pronouns, but how you talk about them. So in a binary system, pronouns are usually male and female. So she, her, and hers, he, him, and his. They're usually male and female pronouns, and there's usually no flexibility within that system. And any challenges to that system usually provoke a lot of fear and mistreatment to the people that challenge it. Now, pronouns in real life. So we have she, he, and they, the ones that we just talked about. And then there's also a bunch of other ones that people will use to identify themselves. People will usually take a combination of gender-neutral vowels and consonants to create their own pronoun that they want to be identified as. So you have zir, here, ne, ve, and ze. And then the last thing there is a suffix. And that is something that I use, as a matter of fact, on my checks. Because you know how people call everybody like Miss and Mr. and that kind of thing? When you want to be formal but you're gender neutral, you can put an X after the M. And actually, as I said, I do that on my checks because I want to look like an adult when I pay my rent. And that's what I use to formalize myself. Other people may just prefer to not use a suffix, and that's totally up to them. And flexibility and individuality with pronouns are really, really important to non-binary and gender neutral people. So this is a really great quote that I got from an anthology of poetry called Troubling the Line. It's an anthology of queer and trans poetry. I would definitely encourage you guys to check it out. It's got a bunch of great work. But this is a point that I think is really interesting to make. So irrespective of male or female pronouns, I'd still identify as transgender. My decision to use he challenges conventional gender norms. So it's important to note that if somebody is transgender and they have the means and the desire to transition, and they do, just because they're identifying as the opposite sex that they were born doesn't necessarily mean that they're not trans anymore. And something else that's really, really important to note is that transgender people are not required to have surgery of any kind to be transgender. As a matter of fact, a lot of people can't. One reason is because insurance prices are obscenely high, regardless of copays. I mean, I know for me, if I were interested in top surgery, it would cost me about $10,000 out of pocket. The other thing is if you don't have health insurance, it's probably double or triple that amount. Also, people that are transgender may have come out to their families and then had an unsupportive experience, and so they might not have any financial support to rely on. The last thing is, you could be trans and just not want surgery. Maybe you don't feel entirely, at right with your body, but you do what you are comfortable with, and then that's that, and you don't want to have surgery. That is not a requirement for being trans. As a matter of fact, there really aren't any requirements for being trans, other than you just don't identify with the skin that you were born in. So here's some tips for pronoun usage. Ask how people prefer to identify and observe that. Think about it as a law. If you meet someone and they say, hello, my pronouns are she, her, you're not going to call them he, because that's not what they want to be called. It's like, my name is Sam, if you called me Sarah, what's going on there? That's not my right name. Pronouns are the same way. You should also get into the habit of introducing yourself with pronouns, because that normalizes the asking process, even if you're within the gender binary. So say you're straight and cisgendered and you're just, run-of-the-mill doing your thing, introduce yourself with your pronouns anyway, because you can never, it's not like we're all walking around with a little secret radar and we're like, oh, look, we're sending out the beeper. That's a transgender person. You're not supposed to try and figure out who's trans because you can't, because everybody is different. But you should assume that anywhere you are, especially in a college or a university or a work setting, there's going to be a bunch of different identities. So you should just get in the habit of trying to figure out what people's pronouns are so you can respect them and avoid misgendering them. So here are some gender identity do's and don'ts. There we go. Okay. So be supportive and offer resources whenever you can. Some really great resources to start with are any kind of places on your campus that might be a queer-friendly space, any kind of counseling center on your campus, because as we'll get into later, there are a lot of mental health-related things that come with being trans. You should try and make sure that you read a little bit about what it's like to be transgender. There are plenty of blogs out there where people, put out their opinions about what it's like living as a trans person. And you can also share this TED Talk, because it's going to be everywhere. That is a shameless plug. You can also read there's a bunch of studies online. GLAAD has published a lot, and so is the HRC, if you want to get into more of a numerical side of what it's like to be trans and what those statistics actually look like. The second thing you should do is stand up for your friends or loved ones if someone gets their pronouns wrong, and set a good example. So my partner was one of the first people to start using my pronouns gender neutrally. And at first it took people in my life, even people that I was close with, to, adjust a little bit. It took them a little bit of time. And some of them were still calling me she. And my partner would be like, you know what, actually, they use they pronouns. And what happened was this really amazing thing. It was this web of acceptance. And I know that sounds corny, but that's what happened. Because one person would get into the habit of, okay, yep, they identify as they. And then they would see somebody else misgender me, and they would say, wait, no, their pronouns are they. And the more you do that, the more it expands and just creates a really, really cool accepting space. The last thing you should do is use gender-neutral pronouns like they if you don't know what someone prefers. So if you meet a person, just to avoid harmfully misgendering them, on the off chance that they are transgender, but even if they're not, try and get into the habit of saying, oh yeah, they were saying this, or call them a person or something, because you can, like I said earlier, you can never tell, and you shouldn't try and discern who's transgender. You should just know that there's a lot of identities out there. And so if you get into the habit of existing in a neutral space, you're being really, really cool, and you're being a gender binary smasher. And yes, that should go on a sticker for a laptop because it's a pretty cool slogan. So here's what not to do. Don't mention the person's identity if they disclose it to you unless they say it's okay. And the reason for this is something we'll get into when we start talking about mental health. That's because we live in a world that is very, very dangerous for people that exist outside of a binary system. People literally die because they're transgender. And while that might sound like an extreme, it's just a fact. And beyond that, people can be bullied, they can be harassed, they might just feel uncomfortable being out of the closet at a very base level. So try and make sure that you have a conversation with the person who's out to you and say, listen, what is it cool for me to say other than using your right pronouns? What should I do, what shouldn't I do, that kind of thing. Don't treat pronouns like they're an accessory. I woke up this morning, I deliberately decided what tie to put on, but I rifled through a bunch of them. I don't do that with my pronouns because it's like, I can't change that. That is who I am. And anybody else that's using any other kind of pronoun, that is who they are. That's not going to change. It's not, something that they just flippantly were like, ooh, you know what? Today I'm they. There's a thought process that happens behind that, and there's a lot of emotional and mental strife that happens when somebody chooses to use their pronouns that fit them. So don't treat it like it's just, something that they just decided to do one day. And don't tell people that it's too difficult to use their right pronouns. Now, I have had, for the most part, a very, very positive experience at Emerson. But that being said, I have had a couple of professors who have really bungled the whole pronoun thing. I spoke to one before my classes began at the beginning of the semester, and I said, hi, I know my full name is on my roster, but I use they, them pronouns, and I'd appreciate it, if in class we could use those. And the professor said, well, that sounds really complicated, but I'll give it a shot. And what I heard, so you just did this face that a lot of people do when I say that. People were like, what? And that's what it is, because a person, people are complicated, obviously, but a person's identity is not complicated. That's who they are, And so if you tell someone, yeah, all right, I'll try, but that sounds really hard, what you're saying is, I don't really care, but I'll just, I'll humor you. And that made for what has turned into an actually very detrimental and kind of rocky learning space for me in that particular classroom. And, I've taken steps to remedy that, and Emerson definitely has a lot of resources for people here, but the bottom line is, schools and universities are places where we're supposed to expand our horizons, and we're supposed to learn how to think differently, and we're supposed to figure out how we want to treat each other and everything like that. And if you don't feel safe in a classroom for whatever reason, especially if it's gender related, you shouldn't have to feel like that, Emerson prides itself on expressing itself and evolving, and the only way that we can do that is if we respect each other's identities. So now here's why all of this is important. As if it wasn't enough to just say, this person has an identity, it's valid, here are some numbers that probably will get you thinking. This is a quote from a trans poet named Delo, who is the gatekeeper because I want back in. So here's a trans timeline. Homo sapiens have existed on this planet for 200,000 years. Modern civilization was defined as starting in 1877. Gays and lesbians got the right to marry in 2015, and transgender protections in public are still a question mark. Now, it's worth noting that most states have laws that are designed to protect you from discrimination based on your sexuality. A lot of states, as a matter of fact, 31 out of 50 states do not have any laws that are protecting transgender people from any discrimination based on their gender identity or presentation. And we're seeing that now with states like Georgia, who the governor there just vetoed a bill, and then we're also seeing North Carolina, which is in the midst of this really interesting turmoil that's happening because a bill just got passed that said transgender people need to use the bathroom of the genitalia they were assigned at birth. So if you want to know more about that, check online. There's a bunch of stuff on Twitter, too, that's really interesting. So this stuff is happening right now. This is a graphic from the Human Rights Campaign, and this was released in March of 2016, so very, very recently. So only 19 states and the District of Columbia explicitly prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. 3 states prohibit discrimination just based on sex, And then we have 9 that actually have very active laws discriminating against transgender people. So the average public, according to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the Williams Institute, they came up with these numbers in their most recent study, which was in 2014. The average general public, out of that whole population, 4.6% of the general public attempts suicide each year. Among transgender people, 41% of people attempt suicide. And that number is a little bit higher among people who are either openly transgender or feel as though, as the study quoted them, they don't pass as their preferred gender. Now, sexual violence is another thing that trans people experience. So out of the LGBTQ population, among transgender people, white trans people were 1.6 times more likely to experience sexual violence and harassment. People of color that were trans were 1.8 times more likely. And you'll see this repeating, that yes, it is true that transgender people across the board are dealing with a multitude of issues that are harmful to them, but it is trans people of color that are also experiencing some of the worst of the discrimination that's happening. When it comes to homicides, out of the LGBTQ demographic, 80% of homicides are queer people of color. 50% of that 80 are trans women of color. And there were 22 transgender people murdered in 2015. 19 of those people were people of color. Most of them were trans women. Now, 57 to 61% report harassment by law enforcement, and 69% of adults, so that's ages 18 and over, report homelessness. That number is astronomically high, and it's still growing when it comes to youth that are transgender. This is a quote from the AFSP Williams study in 2014. So they say, overall, the most striking finding of our analysis was the exceptionally high prevalence of lifetime suicide attempts reported by the National Transgender Discrimination Survey respondents across all demographics and experiences. So we just broke down, the different demographics within, the queer community, but across the board, transgender people are at a higher risk for violence outside and inside themselves. And I'd like to conclude with this. So a little bit of personal experience. I have spent 2 consecutive times of about 3 weeks each in very intensive inpatient mental health facilities in my home state of Rhode Island. A lot of that was because I was born chemically predisposed to depression and anxiety, but also there were a lot of external factors such as, my environment and my sexual and gender identity that kind of brought me to that point. And when I was in the hospital, they had us do this exercise where on one side of a piece of paper you would write down your diagnoses, essentially what kind of mental, emotional, maybe physical obstacles you're dealing with. And then on the other side of the paper, you would write down things about yourself that you liked or that you were proud of. And this is something that anybody can do, but I think it's important to conclude with it because while we're at a very, very dire state of emergency for transgender people in this country, there's still transgender people doing a lot of positive things. And I am incredibly blessed to be able to be here on this stage educating you about this. So I've been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, OCD, dysphoria, which means that you basically don't feel at home in your own body, and a little bit of PTSD. But I'm also a journalist. I'm a caretaker. I'd like to think I'm a pretty good partner, even though I'm kind of annoying sometimes. I'm a Buddhist, an artist, a feminist, and an activist, and I am so much more than a statistic. But I still am a statistic. I can't go outside in Boston without dealing with some kind of harassment every day, and if I'm inside, I deal with misgendering at least 15 to 20 times a day, and that is not an exaggeration. And I'm not the only person who deals with this. And because of my skin color, I'm at an advantage. I'm actually less likely to be murdered, even though I'm still likely to be murdered. So I'm not trying to leave you guys on a depressing note, but this is just the reality that we're dealing with. Transgender people are facing so much more than just laws saying, you need to use this bathroom. While that is definitely harmful, there are also fatalities happening. So I would encourage you to do whatever you can to read up on trans issues. If you have any friends in your life that are openly trans, talk to them and check in with them as much as you can and see how they're doing. And do whatever you can to be an ally. And remember, pronouns are not an accessory. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to TED for putting this on. Have a good one.